It is a truth often unacknowledged that certain metaphors are more familiar to readers than others. To speak of God as shepherd does not raise eyebrows, but to remind people that the God of the Bible is compared to an eyelid, a lion, or even a midwife is sure to surprise and even produce disbelief. This afternoon, I would like to take you on a tour of some unfamiliar metaphors that are almost never part of liturgies, worship, or cultural discourse. Though the strangeness of these images might predispose us to dismiss them or even see them as irrelevant, I suggest that the opposite is true, that their newness and their strangeness forces a reconsideration of how our culture pictures the divine. So, what is a metaphor? Let's begin with the basics. I'm assuming that most of you were taught in school the standard definition of metaphor, that a metaphor is a comparison between two objects. Teachers would often follow this up by saying that a metaphor differs from a simile because it doesn't have the qualifying words like or as. So, for example, a simile would be God is like a fortress, but a metaphor is God is a fortress. Both of these use the imagery of fortress, but the metaphor's avoidance of the word like renders the force of the sentence much stronger. They are intimately connected in the metaphor. And this is exactly where my public school education stopped. We looked at comparing, we looked at identification, but we actually didn't look at what was the function, how are metaphors used. When the word comparison is used, it's natural for us to look at the similarities and to ignore some of the differences. So in the example I used above, how is God a fortress? This imagery probably conjures up ideas of permanence, protection, stability, and strength. However, at the heart of the metaphor is bringing two very different ideas together for the point of comparison and for contrast. And we call this the is and the is not function of the metaphor. Therefore, how is God not a fortress? Where does the metaphor collapse? You might answer, fortresses, though strong, do break down. Eventually, they're not something that lasts forever. They are the work of humans after all. Writers are fully aware that the metaphor is an imperfect vehicle for describing anything, let alone the divine. However, by bringing these two sets of ideas, God and fortress, the commonalities are highlighted and the dissimilarities are momentarily obscured. As Sally McFaig writes, since metaphors are imaginative leaps across the distance, the best metaphor is always giving a shock of recognition, both a shock and a shock of recognition. A metaphoric theology will dare to take risks as well, for the recognition does not come without the shock. I want to start today. Metaphors are particularly effective when two objects they compare are not natural partners. And that's what I want to focus on today. Metaphors that are more uncanny, a little more strange, that shock and perhaps delight us. These metaphors abound in the Hebrew Bible, but unfortunately, they're hidden from sight, languishing in the dusty corners of our Bibles. And I've chosen three for us today. I want us to look at the eyelid, the lion, and the midwife. So I'm going to start with perhaps the strangest of all metaphors that my students are well aware of. That is one of my favorites. And it is that of God as the holy eyelid. When I bring up this image for God, I get incredulous looks from people, quickly followed by their denial that this is in fact a biblical metaphor. And so I then get the privilege of introducing them to Deuteronomy chapter 32, known as the Song of Moses. And this chapter is a fantastic amalgamation of metaphors layered upon metaphors. The predominant one is God as rock, the one that protects and is steadfast. But also we find God portrayed as a father, an eagle, and a nursing mother, each image building on one another, reinforcing the idea of protection and nurture from the divine. But hidden amongst all of these more well-known metaphors is the following. So you have it here on the screen. It says, God sustained him, Israel, in a desert land. In a howling wilderness waste, God shielded him, cared for him, and guarded him as the apple of his eye. The Song of Moses is set in the time of the wilderness wanderings for the Israelites after the escape from Egypt. And until I started working on this talk, I didn't really take into account how important the wilderness setting was for this metaphor. The lion, a howling wilderness waste, impresses upon one the isolation and vulnerability of this harsh land that left the Israelites exposed to the elements. These weary wilderness travelers would have been intimately familiar with the dust and dirt that irritated their eyes. They would have also been familiar with the sun and the sunlight that glared in their eyes for hours on end. The image of God as an eyelid that shields and cares and guards Israel as the apple of God's eye reinforces this instinctive reflex of care and protection that God shows towards Israel. Israel here portrayed as the pupil or the eyelid. And eyeball. There is no hesitation. God here is the eyelid that moves automatically to shield the eye, Israel, from any irritation or danger. Even though I've been referring to God as quote unquote the holy eyelid, we don't find that exact term here because this is an implied metaphor. You have to go digging for it. But this metaphor brilliantly captures both the vulnerability of the Israelites and the instinctive protection of God. And though it might strike us initially as odd, it makes perfect sense within the context of Deuteronomy 32 and adds to the many metaphors we see here. My second metaphor I want to take you to is the lion. God is lion. And this one is uncanny. It is unsettling, even if it is somewhat a bit more familiar to us. God as lion is especially well known in the prophets, conjuring up notions of protection and strength and perhaps even royalty. Inherent in this metaphor, even when it's used positively, when God protects Jerusalem as a lion, is that this wild beast is dangerous, threatening, and wild. But what happens when this lion that once protected Israel now turns against it? This negative and terrifying metaphor of God is not unfamiliar in the Hebrew Bible, especially when describing God's acts of judgment, especially when Israel is accused of failing to follow covenant. One of the most iconic moments of judgment occurs in 587 BCE when the Babylonians attack and destroy Jerusalem, including the temple. The Book of Lamentations gives an account of life in Jerusalem, where the people are not only wrestling with the reality of foreign invaders on their land, but the fact that God is the one at work behind it all. And this is what we hear from the poet in Lamentations chapter 3. He, God, has walled me about so I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me, though I call and cry for help. He shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stones. He has blocked my path. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He has led me off my way and torn me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a mark for his arrow. This is incredibly difficult language to read, language that describes the God of Israel. And it's not simply that the city is destroyed, but it's God who has turned against them. God is the bear that lies in wait, ready to attack. The lion that once protected their city has now turned against it and torn them to pieces. Layered on top of these images of God as a wild beast is that God, the warrior, has set Israel in his sight, ready to take aim. These metaphors are incredibly disruptive. They are, in fact, earth-shattering. The writer takes images that once brought comfort and a sense of safety and flips them around. Israel is no longer protected. Israel is prey. The writer of Lamentations also seems unsettled by these words and seeks to tame this wild theology by saying Israel has transgressed and rebelled. This is not an isolated incident of metaphorical terror. The image of God who attacks is found throughout the Old Testament. But I want to take you now to a third metaphor, and that is the midwife. This one might be a bit unfamiliar to you, that of God as a midwife. And biblical texts contain many references to God as a mother or a bird, a birthing mother, a seamstress, an angry mother bear, or even a midwife. But where are these metaphors today? Why aren't they in our sermons and our songs and our liturgy? Why aren't they in our general speech about God? Familiar metaphors of God are often dismissed as marginal, thus justifying their exclusion from teaching, preaching, and songwriting and singing. However, scholar Juliana Claessens argues that minor voices in a text are deeply significant in bringing new insights and should not be ignored. In fact, these infrequent feminine images of God disrupt the status quo that upholds the male as divine. They call attention to voices that were historically and continue to be marginalized and lack access to power. And despite its infrequency, the actual presence and even survival of the midwifery imagery amongst so much male-dominant metaphorical language is actually something to be cherished and something to be celebrated. So let's look quickly at Psalm 22. You might be familiar with this. It starts with the very famous words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The psalmist is in despair. This is a psalm of lament, and they're trying to process their trauma. We see in verse 2, the psalmist says, "I cry in the daytime, but you do not answer me, and by night also, and I find no rest." But where they do find comfort is in the next part here, in verse 9. The psalmist says, "But it was you who took me out of the womb and laid me on my mother's breast. On you I was cast ever since I was born. You are my God, even from my mother's womb." So despite feeling abandoned, the psalmist doesn't find hope in the old metaphors. There's metaphors in this psalm about God as a warrior. That's not where the psalmist finds hope. Instead, they find hope in the image of God as midwife, the one that will rescue them and protect them. And it is the metaphor of God as midwife here that is not dominant anywhere else in Scripture. You find it in Psalm 71, but that's it. But it also is not insignificant. It is pivotal in helping the psalmist to move from despair to hope. In their old traditions of a warrior God that saves them, the psalmist, as I said, still feels absent and alone. They trust that God will deliver them, but here it's the image of the midwife that brings them comfort. And Juliana Clausen says a really amazing line. She says that this midwife imagery connects God to life and not to death. And I think we need to rethink some of our metaphors in light of that. So in conclusion, metaphors we use for the divine are all incomplete. The human attempts to capture the divine will ultimately all fail. But whether God is a warrior, a shepherd, an angry mother bear, a determined midwife, or a rock, each of these images help us to gain a glimpse of how God works. When we ignore the minor, and I would say quote unquote minor images of the divine, one's view of God becomes flattened, and we risk seeing God only in the image of those in positions of power and dominance. The metaphors we turn to say more about us sometimes than the one we're trying to describe. Neil Postman writes, "A metaphor is not an ornament. It is an organ of perception. Through metaphors, we see the world as one thing or another." Metaphors matter. They aren't extra flourishes. Instead, they impart truth of the way humans have recorded their encounters with God, even when they're partially successful. Thank you.